The streets of Calcutta filled with people who could no longer stand. Mothers walked 40 miles, carrying children already gone, still in their arms. Men sold their tools, then their land, then their daughters, just to buy a single day's food. By the time the monsoon came, bodies lined the roads faster than anyone could bury them. 3 million people, dead, in under a year, not from a bomb, not from a bullet, from the absence of one single grain. A grain so common that no one in that city had ever once thought to fear it. A grain sitting in warehouses less than 100 miles away, hoarded, taxed, shipped off to feed soldiers fighting a war on the other side of the world. The people starving in the streets weren't looking at a famine caused by nature. They were looking at what happens when the thing every one of them depended on to survive gets taken out of their hands. At the center of all of it was rice, a small, white seed, boiled in a pot every single day in nearly every home across nearly every country in Asia. So ordinary, so unremarkable that most people alive in 1943 would have laughed if you told them this exact grain had already built and shattered more empires than gold, oil, or steel combined. Because rice didn't just feed Bengal, rice built the very idea of civilization in half the world. 10,000 years earlier, in the marshy river valleys of what's now southern China, humans did something that had never been done before. They took a wild, unremarkable grass, one that barely fed a handful of people per harvest, and they bent it, generation after generation, into something that could feed thousands from a single field. That decision, made by people whose names no one will ever know, didn't just create a food source. It created surplus. It created villages that didn't need to move. It created the very first governments because someone, somewhere, had to decide who controlled the grain. And once something can feed an empire, it can just as easily starve one. That's the story hiding inside every bowl of rice on earth. Not a story about farming, a story about power. Who holds the grain and who gets left with nothing when they do. This is the history of rice, the grain that fed more human beings than any other food in history, and starved more of them too. To understand how a bowl of rice could bury 3 million people in a single year, you have to go back, not centuries, millennia. Roughly 9,000 years before Bengal starved, in the humid river basins of the Yangtze Valley, there was no rice as we know it. There was only a wild grass, thin, scraggly, growing in scattered patches along muddy riverbanks. It shattered its own seeds the moment they ripened, scattering them into the mud before anyone could gather them. It fed birds. It fed almost no one else. Early hunter-gatherers in the region noticed something small. A handful of these wild grass plants held their seeds a little longer than the rest, just long enough to be picked by hand instead of lost to the wind. So they picked them, and they kept the seeds, and the next season they planted those seeds, instead of gathering wild ones at random. They didn't know what they were starting. Generation after generation, without writing anything down, without a single named inventor, without any understanding of genetics, these early communities were quietly rewriting the DNA of a plant, favoring the seeds that stayed on the stalk longer, favoring the plants that grew fuller, denser, easier to harvest in bulk. This happened slowly enough that no single person could have called it invention. No one woke up one morning and declared they had created rice. It was thousands of small, patient decisions repeated over roughly 3,000 years until the wild grass had become something new entirely, a domesticated grain that could not survive without humans, and humans who increasingly could not survive without it. This is the part almost no one thinks about when they eat rice today. It is not a naturally occurring food. It is arguably humanity's first true technology. Living machine, engineered slowly by hand, designed for one purpose: produce as much edible energy as possible from as small a plot of land as possible, and that single fact changed everything downstream of it. Because a grain that grows in shallow flooded water in fields that can be replanted year after year without exhausting the soil does something no other food source at the time could do. It produces surplus, not just enough to feed the people who grew it, more, extra, stored, saved. And the moment a community has surplus food, something happens that has nothing to do with farming at all. People stop moving. For nearly the entire span of human existence before this point, groups had followed food, chasing herds, following seasonal fruiting, migrating with the land. But rice paddies don't move. You can't follow a rice field across a continent. If you want the surplus that rice provides, you have to stay. You have to build near the water. You have to defend the field from your neighbors and remember which family planted which paddy last season. Villages appeared, then permanent settlements, then something new in human history, population density high enough that people needed rules for who owned what, who worked which field, who got fed first in a bad year, and who didn't. Archaeologists digging in the lower Yangtze have found evidence of organized rice paddies dating back roughly 6,000 years. Not scattered patches, but engineered systems with irrigation channels, raised banks, and evidence of communal labor. That word matters, communal. It means that by this point, growing rice already required cooperation between families who weren't related to each other. It required someone to organize the labor. It required someone to decide how the harvest would be divided. In other words, before rice, there was no need for anyone to be in charge. After rice, there very much was. This is the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath every later chapter of this story. The empires, the wars, the famines still to come. Nobody set out to build a civilization. A handful of families along a riverbank just wanted a slightly better harvest than the year before. But surplus creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates control. And control over something as essential as food is, whether anyone intends it or not, control over people. Somewhere in those first flooded fields, thousands of years before anyone had a word for government, the earliest seed of state power was already growing right alongside the rice. No one alive at the time could have known what they were building. For thousands of years, rice fed people. Then, something changed. Rice stopped being just a crop and started being a tool of control, and the people who grew it were the first to feel the difference. By the time organized kingdoms rose across ancient China, then across the river deltas of Southeast Asia, rulers had figured out the same lesson those first riverbank families had stumbled into by accident. Whoever controls the grain controls the people who eat it. So they moved to control it directly. Ancient Chinese dynasties going back as far as the Zhou period began requiring farmers to hand over a fixed portion of every rice harvest as tax, not in coins, but in the grain itself. Officials didn't just collect this tax, they stored it in massive state-run granaries built specifically to hold surplus rice for years at a time. On paper, this sounded almost generous, a safety net for bad harvests, insurance against famine. In practice, it meant one thing: the government now physically possessed the thing every single subject needed to stay alive. This is where the story stops being about farming and starts being about power, because a granary that can feed people in a famine can just as easily starve people in a rebellion. Historical records from multiple Chinese dynasties describe local governors deliberately withholding grain reserves from regions suspected of disloyalty, not accidentally, not due to poor harvests, but as calculated punishment. A grain that could save a village could also, with a single administrative decision, be the reason that village didn't survive the winter. Farmers who resisted the tax system didn't get sympathy, they got punishment. In several dynastic law codes, failing to deliver the required rice quota was treated the same as theft from the state, punishable by beating, forced labor, or worse. The individual farmer, ankle-deep in the same mud his ancestors had stood in thousands of years earlier, was no longer simply growing food for his family. He was growing food for an empire that could, and did, take it by force. And it wasn't only the state that saw rice as something to control. As rice cultivation spread into Southeast Asia, into what's now Vietnam, Thailand, and the islands of Indonesia, colonial powers arriving centuries later saw the exact same opportunity ancient emperors had. The Dutch East India Company, once it took control of rice-producing regions of Java, didn't simply trade for rice. It restructured entire local economies around forced rice production for export, often at the direct expense of the farmer's own food supply. Local communities that had grown rice for their own survival for centuries were now required to grow rice for someone else's profit, on someone else's terms, with local consumption treated as an afterthought. This is the part of rice's history that rarely makes it into a documentary about ancient Asian agriculture. It's not romantic. It's not the story of a peaceful grain feeding peaceful villages for 10,000 years. It's the story of one of the most nutritionally essential foods on the planet being deliberately weaponized, hoarded, taxed, redirected, and withheld by whoever happened to hold power at the time, and ordinary people noticed. They just couldn't do much about it. Peasant uprisings throughout Chinese history, some of them large enough to topple entire dynasties, were frequently triggered not by abstract political grievances, but by grain. Specifically, by grain mismanagement during famine years. Officials who kept granaries locked while people starved outside the gates. Officials who exported rice for profit during a shortage instead of releasing it to the population that grew it. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, the Red Turban Rebellion, uprising after uprising throughout Chinese imperial history, traces its spark back to the same underlying failure, a government that treated the nation's food supply as a possession rather than a shared necessity. None of these farmers were rejecting rice itself. No one in this story ever doubted the grain. What they were rejecting, sometimes violently, sometimes at the cost of their lives, was the idea that someone else got to decide who starved and who didn't, based on a crop the farmers themselves had grown with their own hands. This is the pattern that repeats every single time rice enters a new region of the world. It is never simply adopted as food, it is almost immediately recognized by whoever is in charge as something far more valuable, a lever, a grain dense enough in calories to sustain an army, storable enough to build up during peace and withhold during unrest, essential enough that controlling it means controlling loyalty itself. By the time we reach the era of colonial Asia, the era that leads directly into Bengal, 1943, the streets we opened on, this pattern isn't new. It's ancient, thousands of years old. What changes in the 20th century isn't the logic, it's the scale. Because the same tool that ancient Chinese officials used to punish a single disloyal village was about to be used by an empire on an entire subcontinent during an actual world war, with far more lives on the line than any dynasty had ever controlled at once. Every empire that ever weaponized rice needed people willing to defy it. In 1930, in a small fishing village on the coast of Vietnam, one of them stepped forward, and what happened to her shows exactly how far the machinery of grain control was willing to go to protect itself. Her name was Nguyen Thi Nghia, a young woman working alongside her family as tenant rice farmers under French colonial rule. Her family didn't own the land they worked. Like most peasant farmers across French Indochina, they grew rice on plots controlled by absentee landlords and colonial administrators, handed over the bulk of every harvest in rent and taxes, and kept whatever scraps remained to feed themselves. That year, the math simply didn't work. Rice prices had collapsed on the global market as the Great Depression tightened its grip worldwide, but colonial tax demands on farmers hadn't moved an inch. Families were being asked to hand over the same fixed portion of an already smaller harvest, worth less money than ever, while French administrators still expected full payment. For thousands of farming families across the Heian and Ha Tinh provinces, this wasn't a policy dispute. It was the difference between eating through the winter and not. Nghia didn't organize an army. She didn't have weapons or wealth or standing. What she had was the same thing farmers had used against unjust grain policy for thousands of years before her: numbers and the refusal to stay quiet. She helped organize local peasants into what became known as the Nghe Tinh Soviets, marching alongside thousands of farmers to colonial tax offices and administrative buildings, demanding a reduction in rice taxes to match the collapsed price of the very crop they were being taxed on. The demand wasn't radical, it was arithmetic. Farmers weren't asking for the land, they weren't asking for revolution, they were asking to not be taxed into starvation on a grain whose market value had been cut in half. The French colonial government's answer wasn't negotiation, it was force. Colonial authorities responded to the demonstrations with direct military action, including airstrikes on assembled crowds of unarmed farmers, a scale of violence rarely used against peasant tax protests anywhere in the world at that time. Historical estimates suggest hundreds of protesters were killed across the uprising, with thousands more arrested, imprisoned, or executed in the crackdown that followed through 1931. Nghia herself was arrested by colonial police for her role organizing the movement. What makes this moment matter isn't the size of the rebellion. Plenty of larger uprisings throughout history moved more territory, toppled more governments, made more history books. What makes it matter is what it reveals in miniature. A colonial government was willing to deploy military air power against its own unarmed farmers, rather than adjust a tax on rice to match its own collapsed market price. Think about the imbalance in that decision. Air power, one of the most advanced military technologies available in 1930, turned against people whose only demand was to keep enough of their own harvest to survive the season. That is not a government protecting order. That is a government protecting control over the grain supply at any cost, because whoever controls that grain controls whether an entire region eats or starves. Nghyia's uprising didn't win. The tax stayed. The landlords kept their land. French colonial administration remained firmly in place across Indochina for another 2.5 decades. But something didn't go away either. The memory of it did not disappear from the farmers who survived it, nor from the wider anti-colonial movements gathering momentum across Vietnam in the years that followed. The Nghe Tinh uprising became one of the earliest organized peasant movements directly tied to what would eventually grow into Vietnam's broader independence struggle decades later. A struggle that, in no small part, always circled back to the same original grievance: land, grain, who controls the harvest, and who starves when they do. One young woman, one province, one collapsed rice tax. It wasn't enough to stop an empire in 1930, but it was proof that people would rather face bombs from the sky than quietly starve for someone else's profit, and that pattern was about to repeat itself 13 years later on a scale no single uprising could have prepared anyone for. By the time we returned to Calcutta, the pattern that started with a handful of families in a muddy riverbed thousands of years earlier had scaled up into something almost incomprehensible. This time, the hand gripping the grain wasn't a dynasty. It was a global empire fighting a global war. Early in 1942, Japanese forces swept through Burma, at the time one of the largest rice exporting regions on Earth, and a critical food source for British-controlled India. The fall of Burma and Singapore to Japan halted rice exports from those countries into India, and a cyclone that October further damaged the region's rice crop. On its own, this was a supply shock, serious but survivable. What turned it into a catastrophe was the decision that came next. Fearing a Japanese invasion through the same delta region, colonial authorities ordered the seizure of surplus food and transport boats from villages across coastal Bengal, a strategy known as the denial policy, designed to ensure that if Japan did invade, it would find nothing to requisition. Factually, thousands of boats, the same boats farmers used to move rice to fish to reach markets, were confiscated or destroyed by the same government meant to protect them. The intent was military. The effect was civilian. With supply lines disrupted and confidence shaken, anxiety about shortages triggered hoarding and speculation, and prices climbed until even a basic diet slipped out of reach for Bengal's poorest workers, Hillsdale College, the same workers who spent their lives growing the rice, now priced beyond them. Rice prices in Calcutta rose nearly tenfold between 1941 and mid-1943, not because the grain had vanished, but because the system meant to move it from field to table had been deliberately dismantled from above. And this is the detail that separates Bengal from almost every famine before it. According to economist Amartya Sen, in the streets, the Bengal government, backed by the British Army, managed to distribute more than 110 million free meals that year, and it barely scratched the surface of what the population actually needed. Hillsdale College, 3 million lives, one grain, one collapsed system of distribution, sitting on top of millennia of the exact same lesson repeating itself. Rice was never just food. From the first flooded paddy to the last locked warehouse, it was always the lever. And in 1943, an empire at war pulled that lever harder than any dynasty in history ever had. Bengal, it turns out, was not the worst chapter in rice's history. It wasn't even close. 16 years later, on the other side of Asia, the same grain would be at the center of the deadliest famine ever recorded, not caused by war, not caused by an invading army, but caused entirely by a government's own numbers. Starting in 1958, China's leadership under Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, a sweeping campaign to collectivize farmland and rapidly industrialize the countryside. Farmers were barred from planting or fishing independently. Every grain of rice now belonged to the state, and farmers had to meet fixed grain quotas just to earn rations at communal canteens. Bowdoin College. The individual farmer, the same figure who had stood ankle-deep in paddies for 10,000 years, making his own decisions about his own harvest, had, for the first time in the entire history of rice, no legal claim to the crop he grew. And then the numbers stopped being true. Terrified of being labelled disloyal after a prior political crackdown, local officials began falsifying harvest reports, inflating yields to match whatever figures their superiors expected to hear. Arxiv. Some staged entire fields for inspection, transplanting rice along the routes Mao would travel to manufacture the illusion of impossibly dense, record-breaking crops. Arxiv. One year, the government reported roughly 375 million tons of grain nationally. Actual production was closer to 200 million tons. Facts and details. The gap between those two numbers is where the deaths happened. Because grain quotas weren't based on what farmers actually grew, they were based on what the government believed had been grown. The inflated, fictional number. Each region was assigned a procurement target far above its real yield, and when villages couldn't produce grain that didn't exist, officials didn't lower the quota. They emptied the village instead. Wikipedia, shipping local harvests to central granaries to meet targets on paper, regardless of what that left behind for the people who had grown it. When the promised abundance failed to materialize, the state's response wasn't to investigate the shortfall. It was to accuse peasants of hiding grain, triggering house-to-house searches with resistance met by violence. Bowdoin College. Families who had already surrendered their harvest, their tools, and their kitchens to communal control were now searched for a surplus that had never existed anywhere except in a falsified report sitting on a desk in Beijing. The burden fell hardest on the countryside itself. Rural grain procurement was sharply increased specifically to feed the cities, even as rural populations were the ones starving. Arxiv. The people growing the rice were, quite literally, feeding everyone except themselves. Estimates of the death toll from what followed range so widely, from 15 million to as high as 55 million people. Association for Asian Studies, that historians still can't agree on a single number, only that it stands among the largest losses of human life from famine ever documented on Earth. This is the sealing of the pattern that started 9,000 years earlier, with a handful of families favoring one grass seed over another. Rice built the very first governments because it created something worth controlling. And by 1959, a government had learned to control it so completely, down to the cooking pot, down to the seed for next year's planting, that an entire nation could be told it was thriving while millions of the people growing its most essential crop quietly starved to death in the fields. No war, no famine of nature, just paperwork, quotas, and the same ancient lesson taken to its absolute extreme. Whoever controls the grain controls whether you live. Today, none of this looks like history. It looks like breakfast. Rice remains the single most consumed staple food on Earth, feeding more than half the world's population daily. Over 3.5 billion people rely on it as their primary source of calories, more than any other crop humans have ever grown. In much of Asia, a meal without rice isn't considered a meal at all. The grain that built the first governments in human history is now so ordinary that most people eating it have never once paused mid-bite to ask where the bowl in front of them actually comes from, or what it's cost across 10,000 years for that bowl to exist at all. But the pattern hasn't disappeared. It's just quieter now. Rice remains one of the most politically sensitive commodities on the planet. Governments across Asia still maintain strategic rice reserves for the exact same reason ancient granaries existed, because a population that can be fed can also, if supplies are mismanaged or withheld, very quickly become a population that cannot. In 2008, a wave of panic and export restrictions among major rice-producing nations caused global rice prices to spike so sharply, so suddenly, that several countries faced real civil unrest over the price of a single bag of grain. Not a famine of production, but a crisis of access, playing out in real time, in an era of satellites and global shipping. The same entitlement failure that Amartya Sen identified in Bengal 65 years earlier hadn't vanished. It had simply found a new decade. Even now, rice-growing communities across South and Southeast Asia remain some of the most economically vulnerable populations on the continent. Farmers whose labor still feeds nations and whose margins still depend heavily on decisions made by governments, traders and markets far outside their own fields. The tenant farmer standing in ankle-deep water today is doing something almost unchanged, technique for technique, from what families were doing in the Yangtze Valley 9,000 years ago. What has changed is everything sitting on top of that field. The taxes, the export bans, the price controls, the quotas, the reserves, all of it descended in a more or less unbroken line from the very first moment a community realized that surplus grain meant someone had to be in charge of it. That's the part of this story that never actually ends, because rice was never really the subject of this story at all. Rice was the mechanism. The thing that made the story possible was something much older and much more human. The discovery, made independently by farmers, emperors, colonial administrators, and revolutionary governments across 9,000 years and 4 different continents, that if you control what people eat, you control everything else about them too. Loyalty, labor, survival itself. A wild grass that once shattered its seeds into the mud, gathered by hand, by people whose names no one will ever know, became powerful enough to found civilizations and, in the wrong hands, powerful enough to end millions of lives, sometimes through violence and sometimes just through a number written down wrong on a government report. Somewhere right now, someone is eating a bowl of rice without thinking about any of this. That's not ignorance. That's the entire point of how far this grain has traveled, from a scarce, uncertain wild seed that could barely feed a family to something so reliably abundant that most of the world has forgotten it was ever anything other than guaranteed. But it was never guaranteed. Every grain in that bowl exists because 10,000 years of human decisions, some patient, some brutal, some catastrophically wrong, kept the supply chain from breaking completely. The empires that rose on rice and the millions who starved when that same grain was hoarded, taxed, or falsified out of existence are not separate from the meal in front of you tonight. They're the reason it's there at all, and the reason it's worth remembering that the most ordinary thing on your plate has, more than once in human history, been exactly what decided who lived and who didn't. The grain hasn't changed in 10,000 years. The question of who controls it, that's still being answered today. If this kind of history actually surprises you, subscribe, because the next one is even darker.